An investigation is currently underway into Tuesday's blast after more than 150 people were killed and 5,000 wounded in the massive explosion. The blast struck with the force of an earthquake, blowing out windows and doors across the Lebanese capital and leaving several city blocks littered with broken glass, rubble and shattered vehicles. It was the biggest explosion ever seen in the city, which was split in half between 1975 and 1990 during the Civil War and has a long history of bombings and terror attacks. Lebanon was already in the grip of a severe economic crisis rooted in decades of misrule that spawned mass protests last year. Demonstrations have again erupted in Beirut as residents blame the government for the deadly explosion. Over 2,000 tons of highly explosive ammonium nitrate was stored in the port for the last 6 years without adequate safety measures. To discuss the situation further, we are now joined by Roland Henwood, political science lecturer at the University of Pretoria. Roland, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us on Weekend Dawn. Now, who's to blame for this blast on Tuesday that devastated Beirut?
Well, it seems that we have to go back in time to determine that the ammonium nitrate that was stored in the harbour area was taken off a ship that was impounded because it was not seaworthy at the end of 2013. And this ammonium nitrate was ordered by a judge in Beirut to be stored in the harbour. And then it seems that some people have forgotten about it. Now, there are indications or claims from senior harbour officials that they actually wrote the judge and asked for them to take some action because this cargo was being held in an unsafe area, in an unsafe environment, not conducive to storage for this type of cargo. Problem is, it has been there for 7 years, and it is basically not a stable substance that you can just leave there. It's going to decay, and that makes it less stable, and that makes it something that can explode and cause the kind of damage that we've seen. So it points to a judicial process that went wrong in a sense, but also then the bureaucratic process behind that simply couldn't keep up or did not keep up with the requirements and what was needed to deal with this issue.
But what was the intention of the ammonium nitrate when it did dock in Beirut a few years ago? What was it going to be used for?
Well, normally this would be used for either agricultural purposes as fertilizer, or it can be used for explosives, normally in the mining industry. What we've seen in the week are reports that this was destined for Mozambique in 2013. And the ship that was basically transporting this had developed some problems at sea. It first went to Athens, I think, and then it went to Beirut, and they had some emergency work done, but then it was decided the ship cannot be allowed to leave port because it's not seaworthy. The owners then abandoned the ship because the cost that they faced was just too much. They couldn't pay that, so they abandoned the ship, and then they discovered, or they knew of the cargo, and the decision was the cargo must be removed from the ship, probably with the intention of later getting rid of it, selling it or moving it away. And that just never happened. I've seen some reports saying Mozambique claims they have no idea of this and where it comes from. It's got nothing to do with them. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But the bottom line is problems started way before the cargo was unloaded. And the issue then is unloading this cargo in an area where probably people were not up to scratch in terms of the real danger of this, or did not pay attention to those who informed of the problem.
But then who does the neglect lie with then? The fact that it was offloaded and kept in a warehouse at the harbour and nothing was done with it over the past few years. Who's to blame? And do you think the people of Beirut protesting is necessary?
Oh, I think the people of Beirut have all the reasons in the world to be more than just unhappy. What we've seen is a whole destruction of the city centre and the area around the harbour. Indications that 300,000 people are left homeless at this stage and destitute, not just homeless. This, of course, against the backdrop of the economic crisis and the political instability that we've seen Keep in mind also that Lebanon is at the center of a lot of the geopolitical tensions in that part of the world. They're sitting with more than 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. All these add to the tensions and the problems. So I think people have a lot of reasons to be aggrieved. And on top of that, this explosion that essentially destroyed the lives and livelihoods of so many people, this is not something that you can just talk away. As to who's to blame, that's difficult to say. I think that is why there are calls for an independent investigation, an external investigation, not a Lebanese domestic investigation, to try and determine what went wrong. If somebody is to blame, is this just a question of incompetent governance, people just not dealing with things the way they should, and with 7 years elapsing since the offloading of this cargo, people get used to this. There's, of course, a lot of claims from people saying, but we weren't aware of this in the midst of the city, essentially. And this is not acceptable. It's not allowed. It's dangerous. So there would have to be a proper investigation to determine what happens. I think at the end of this, though, the fact that so much destruction and the direct impact on so many people, you're not going to change that with an investigation. So you'd have to have much more than that to try and at least resolve the underlying problems and create some sort of stability and recreate the lives of people. Now, that's a long-term project.
It seems as though, as well, communication about this entire incident when it initially happened was few and far apart from the government in Lebanon. Do you think they need to also add or do better in terms of communicating what is going on in that country from a political aspect, of course, and from a situation where they've got such dangerous equipment being stored at the harbour?
I think one must look at this differently. This is a kind of substance that is manufactured across the world. It is transported many times and nothing happens if you follow the correct procedures and protocols. The substance itself is not necessarily unstable and an immediate threat. If you handle it properly, it's something that can be done, and it's done a lot of times. So there's nothing abnormal about this. I think at issue here is also not the fact that you offloaded this. That seems to have been a prudent step. You can't leave it on a decaying ship that cannot go out to sea again. The issue is where you offload and what you do with it. So you need proper storage, you need proper procedures to be followed to ensure the safety of this. And that happens across the world many, many times over. So that's not the issue. I think what is at issue, if you look at Lebanon, is unfortunately a coming together of poor governance, of incompetence, of neglect. So it's a deadly mixture of things that in the end creates this kind of outcome. And I think that's the lesson to be taken out of this. You can have many things happening and nothing is going to go wrong. But if you have a chain of events where wrong follows wrong follows wrong, in the end you're going to have a catastrophe. And I think that lies at the heart of this. It's something that could have been prevented. It's something that should have been prevented. It wasn't done. Better communication, as I say, it's not a substance that is unknown. It's offloaded many times. It's transported all over the world. No one communicates that as long as you follow procedures. And that is where things go wrong and went wrong in the Lebanon issue.
Do you think the city has recovered from the civil wars of 1990 and the bomb blast of 1975?
I think they've come a long way since then, but recovered is probably difficult to define. We've seen a lot of instability of late, political instability. There's always the issue of conflict that is happening in and around Lebanon, whether it's from the Syrian conflict, whether it's from external role players. Saudi Arabia has often been blamed for what is happening. Whether it is from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that spills over into Lebanon or Israeli-Syrian conflict that spills over. There are many reasons for instability. But one of the issues that is getting a lot of attention is simply bad governance. The fact that you have a political elite that seems to be more focused on itself, that seems to be taking decisions that is not in the best interest of the country. And that is a pattern that has been established in Lebanon for quite a long time. And it underpins these developments, and then things go wrong, and it suddenly goes wrong horribly. and the citizens suffer the results and the consequences of this.
I think on the back of what you're saying about political instability, and I've heard reports of power cuts as well in a situation in Lebanon, it sort of mirrors some similarities to South Africa. Do you think a lot of the things that are happening in Lebanon could sort of filter onto South Africa, or do you find them quite similar as well?
Yes and no. One must be very careful. There are lots of similarities in many countries in the world where you have problems, where you have challenges, where you have issues of governance. But there are also many differences. South Africa does not share the geopolitical challenges that Lebanon has. South Africa does not suffer the fate of instability related to conflict and regional conflicts to the same extent that Lebanon has. But we do share some of the similarities in terms of poor governance and neglect, where officials of government simply are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. That impression of people being in it for themselves rather than being in it also to serve a population, that unfortunately is something that we also see in South Africa. And yes, we do see things go wrong in South Africa because of that. But we are very fortunate that we haven't seen this kind of disaster struck South Africa that we've seen in Beirut. And so there's always something to be thankful for. But I think important is that South Africans must look at what's happening and learn the lessons. And that goes to the citizens as well as those in power.
Roland Henwood, we'll leave it right there, political sciences lecturer at the University of Pretoria, chatting to us about the political crisis in Lebanon and the Beirut blast, which killed over 150 people.